Brutal justice, crime and punishment in the early modern period, 1550 to 1750. In this talk, we'll be discussing how changing society affected the perceptions of crime and how crime was policed in the early modern period. We'll look into the four main types of crime: moral crime, financial crime, social crime, and violent crime. We'll then examine how punishment was used, including how popular justice fitted in with the justice system. After the Reformation of 1534, the state started to increase its power over local justice systems by its use of Parliament to pass many new laws regarding crime. This tied in with a growing concern from the wealthy sectors of society about law and order protecting their wealth and privilege. Prior to the Reformation, law and order had been managed by the church, but then courts were separated from the church and became civil courts. However, politics and religion were intrinsically linked as the state now controlled the church. To protect this central power, the rate of prosecutions for treason increased significantly, and religious dissent was seen as a threat to the Reformation, so it became a crime in itself. At this time, a number of factors combined to lead to a decrease in tolerance. Decline in death and rise in birth rate put pressure on food resources, which led to changes in farming systems, so there was less opportunity to make a living from farming, which in turn led to an increase in vagrancy. This was threatening to the property of the wealthy, who increased the penalties of crimes against property and changed the nature of the law. For example, previously petty offences became criminalised. The church's attitude changed and it intervened less in its merciful role. The criminal code became more harsh. For example, in the 17th century, the age a child could be convicted was reduced from 12 to 7 years old, and insanity was viewed much less sympathetically as there was a growing belief that it could be easily faked. One of the underpinning factors of crime was seen to be alcohol. Alehouses were centres for the disposal of stolen goods and prostitution, and according to commentators at the time, they enticed poor workmen and day labourers to drown their sorrows whilst their wives and children starved. Alehouses frequently kept unlawful hours and could be unlicensed. They were pivotal to the terrible gin craze of the 1700s. This came about because of a 1689 Act of Parliament which banned the import of French brandy and wine, so gin became very cheap and very available. By 1730 there were an estimated 7,000 gin shops, and per capita consumption of spirits tripled. Gin was often sold in pints. This behaviour prompted widespread panic amongst the social elite about the intemperate and foul manners of what they called the lower sorts, and women were particularly implicated in the gin craze. This print by William Hogarth, called Gin Lane, illustrates the story of a lady called Judith de Four, who was executed in 1734. She became so intoxicated with gin that her child was taken away from her, her toddler, and put in a workhouse. She went to get her child back, stole the clothes that had been given by the workhouse and sold them, but at the same time she murdered her child. We don't know whether that was accidentally or on purpose, but she was executed because of that. Many of the members of local policing structures were integrated in the community. Some were friends or relatives of those they policed or even judged. Many were wealthy and served for the status it gave them. Typical policing roles were, first of all, constables. These were unpaid posts held by local gentry. They were peacekeeping roles, not investigative ones. Then there were thief takers, who were a bit like bounty hunters and paid by reward. Sheriffs were unpaid and from the country elite. They had more of an organisational role. They were the link between central and local justice. Justices of the peace were unpaid and the job could be costly and workload heavy. Their main role was adjudication of minor crimes. Judges were in control of the justice system. They knew law and could influence and intimidate juries and JPs. Jail in the early modern period was where people accused of serious crimes could be held until trial. It was a facility of very poor conditions. Prisoners' families paid for clothes and food, and illness was rife. Forensic evidence was rarely brought into trials, as it was in its infancy in those days, and dissection was commonly thought to cause the deceased soul to be eternally damaged. There was, however, a famous case in Hertford in 1699, where the murder victim, a Sarah Stout, was dug up and autopsied on the request of her mother, to prove she had not drowned by suicide, but had been murdered. Although the autopsy did prove she had not been drowned, the forensic evidence was not considered applicable, and even confused the judge, so the 4 defendants were dismissed. So we're going to move on to talk about the different types of crime and how they were viewed in the early modern period. The first one was moral crime. Moral failure was linked to criminal behaviour as it threatened the balance of community and the church's power. Moral crimes were things like sexual offences, slander and defamation, profanation of the Sabbath, for example, things like laymen performing what they called popish rituals, and anyone who, in inverted commas, communed, jangled and talked in church in the time of common prayer. People behaving like drunkards, swearing, blaspheming, and also people who used charms or sorcery or enchantments and even witchcraft and soothsaying. Sex was a big part of moral crime in the eyes of the church and the community. It covered things like adultery, premarital fornication, incest, and lewdness. These offences had the potential to bring about illegitimacy, or what they called bastardy, and to spread immorality and to bring disruption and discord into the local community. The church encouraged spying and community policing, and was also a forum to contest allegations of sexual slander. Men were expected to rule their household and keep their wives and children in order, and therefore cuckolded men were those who failed to live up to the ideals of masculinity and failed to be in control of their household, or failed to keep their wives faithful or in check, and could be publicly shamed. Sometime around 1589 to 1603, the Hertford Court Quarter Sessions report that one husband was bound by the Hertfordshire justices to keep the peace towards his wife, and warned to consort with her and use her honestly, and to stop consorting with a certain harlot whose company he had been frequenting. However, in Redbourne in July in 1583, a lady called Helen Burton caught her husband with another woman, a certain Isabel Todd, but found herself a subject of a defamation suit by Isabel when she tried to tell her neighbours what she had discovered Isabel doing with her husband. The church acted as adjudicators in these moral crimes, and individuals pursued grievances with them, things like to prove the legal status of their marriage, or indeed vice versa, separation on the grounds of their wives' adultery by husbands and their husbands' cruelty by wives. Sometimes they did it to clear their names, or to charge others with defamation. The church was also a licensing body, for example for midwives. Midwives had to be godly, as they were sometimes with babies or mothers at death. They were also a source for informing on prosecuting fathers of illegitimate babies. The clergy were empowered to seek out and punish spiritual nonconformity, but local clergy were not always trusted to do the central church's bidding. They were checked out using Visitation Articles drawn up by Archbishop Cranmer in the 1540s. They were checked on whether they had destroyed all images, shrines, coverings of shrines, paintings, monuments of feigned miracles, pilgrimages, idolatry and superstition. They were checked whether the Bible was in English and was publicly available. They were checked whether they kept a register of weddings, christenings and burials. They were also checked that they kept a poor man's box in which the congregation could bestow what they had formerly spent on pardons, pilgrimages and masses under the Catholic Church. Punishment for moral crimes was less about retribution and more about reform. There were rituals of repentance and reconciliation. Defendants were either declared guilty of charges or dismissed if succeeded, or if a witness vouched for their character. Prior to the Reformation, a guilty penitent was forced to process around his church bearing a candle that was placed before the high altar or shrine. After the Reformation, public penance took the form of public rebuke, a penitent's stool or sackcloth. In extreme circumstances, the offender could be excluded from the communion of the faithful, for example, the church community. This was a terrible punishment in those days. One of the most extreme cases of moral crime took place in Hemel Hempstead. On the 27th of August 1753, Job Wells was hanged in Hertford for the incestuous armed rape of his 16-year-old daughter Maria in their home in Hemel Hempstead, whilst threatening her with a knife. Poor Maria had to give detailed evidence against her father in public court. The public nature of the trial would have affected her reputation for life. Rape itself was not reliably punished by execution, if at all, but the incestuous nature of the rape in this case meant that he felt the full force of the law. The second type of crime we're going to talk about is financial crime. The financial system was quite different than it is today. Coins were usually made out of precious metals, which made them valuable for people to do other things with, like melting them down or hoarding them. It also made them difficult to transport because they were heavy and people were at risk of being burgled. There was also a shortage of coinage in circulation, especially small change. The economy started to become reliant on paper credit at every level. That operated quite well, but did make it vulnerable to weak links in the chain, and also, of course, very vulnerable to counterfeiting. Two of the most common forms of financial crimes were coining and uttering. Coining was where tiny bits of coins were clipped off and melted down to mould into new coins. And uttering was the passing of counterfeit coins and notes, and sometimes manufacturing counterfeit paper money, like banknotes or bills of exchange. Technically, coining of gold or silver was a form of treason and punished by the death penalty. These were part of the economy of makeshift, which is a term sometimes used to describe the desperate and disorganised attempts of the poor to make ends meet. It often took place at home, hence a high level of female participation. Coinage was problematic throughout the early modern period. The high point of coining was in the 1690s due to war and economic strains. Isaac Newton became the master of the mint in the early 1696, and he presided over the recoinage. He investigated coining and managed interviews with informers and coiners, and improved the administration. He experimented with processes, especially relating to the purity of copper coinage. Fraud was considered the fraudulent making or altering of a written document to the detriment of another person's right. It included fraudulently copying or counterfeiting documents other than money, such as stamps or bonds, and was an acknowledgement that paper was the root of commerce and that commerce and credit were heavily interconnected. It was an attack on money and credit, and therefore was an attack on the country's security and prosperity. And the country needed to protect the Bank of England. The threat of forgery was no longer merely a private loss, it had become a public danger. As credit became more important to society and the economy, it was necessary to exact severe punishments on anyone who undermined trust in credit. Monetary policy, therefore, was dependent on the death penalty. The hangman was considered the only way to restore faith in the economy. The third type of crime we're going to discuss is social crime. Social crime was characterized by the fact that it has elements of protest or organized social resistance, and often has the support of the immediate community. It also often derives from the criminalization of something that was considered a custom historically. It represents a conscious, almost a political challenge to the prevailing social order and its values. Between 1589 and 1603, there was a record of a Hertfordshire organised riot by a lady called Audrey Grave, a bricklayer's wife. She had convinced her friends and servants to gather at night to tear down a fence around a Mr. Fordham's field because, she said, it was common land for which Fordham had promised to leave open. The economy of makeshift had given people inferred rights to gather local material to survive, often exploiting ancient custom rights that gave free or cheap sources of food or fuel. People believed these rights were justified in the Bible. By the end of the 18th century, there were increased attempts to protect private property, which was at the expense of customary rights. Some so-called social crimes, however, had always been criminal, things like poaching, wrecking and smuggling, sometimes by organised gangs, not just by poor individuals. I'm going to have a look at a few of these social crimes in a bit more detail. First of all, smuggling. Smuggling was, and in fact still is, the avoidance of import and export duties. In the early modern period, things like chocolate, tea, leather, beer, and wines and spirits were all subject to tax duties. By the middle of the 18th century, the duty on tea was almost 70% of its initial cost. Smugglers were usually merchants and tradesmen who dealt in large quantities of key products like wool. Lower class smugglers who operated small scale and dealt in basic foodstuffs and some luxury items like tea and brandy, for example. At its basic level, the poor felt that they had a right to avoid the duty on goods. In 1749, the Duke of Richmond complained that the common people of this country have no notion that smuggling is a crime. The Hawkenhurst gang was a gang of sometimes violent smugglers active across southeast England, but they gained popular approval and their efforts were supported by local communities. But popular opinion turned against them after they whipped and brutally murdered an informant and customs officer. The Commutation Act of 1784 reduced tea duties from 119% to 12.5%. Smuggling of tea was all but eradicated. However, revenue was not lost because of the increased consumption of legal tea. Another type of social crime was wrecking. This stemmed from customary rights to salvage shipwrecked goods. However, it also involved organised gangs who would lure ships onto the rocks to wreck them, and this became an even more serious concern during the 18th century as a result of the increase in shipping. In 1735, London merchants petitioned Parliament to do more to enforce the new Act in 1753, which made it a capital offence to use false lights, lure ships and plunder goods. One of the most common forms of social crime was poaching. The right to hunt game was given to the wealthy and was considered an elite pastime, but this conflicted with the poor who felt it was their right to poach based on historic customary rights to common lands. An example of this was the digger movement of the 1650s. The diggers were a group of Protestant anarchic radicals in England who attempted to farm on common land. Laws against poaching became harsher during the early modern period, and Parliament imposed property qualifications in order for people to hunt game. The Game Act of 1671 said that somebody had to have £100 to pay for the freehold of an area in order to hunt on it. Man-traps were used by landowners to catch poachers. Not all poachers did it just for the pot. There were some who poached for profit. The final social crime I'm going to mention was wood gathering. This covered activities from chopping down a whole tree to just gathering fallen branches. For the poor, it was an important source of fuel and customary right, but the elite saw it as an attack on their property, even though manorial rights allowed it on certain days. In 1766, it became an offence to willfully cut or break down, bark, burn, pluck up, lop, top, crop, or otherwise deface, damage, despoil, destroy, or carry away any timber tree. The punishment could be quite severe. For a first offence, there was a fine of £20 or 6 to 12 months imprisonment. The second offence, there was increased fine and more imprisonment, and for a third offence, there was possible transportation for 7 years. The final type of crime I'm going to talk about is violent crime, and primarily we're going to discuss the different types of murder. Murder covered infanticide, manslaughter, murder, and petty treason, which was defined by the Treason Act of 1351 originally as the killing of a master by a servant, a husband by his wife, or an ecclesiastical superior by his inferior. There were recognised differences between more and less abhorrent forms of murder, and key to those distinctions was the degree of malice or premeditation, for example planning, and also whether it occurred in what they called hot or cold blood. Both the suddenness and the hotness of blood served to mark some killings as less heinous than others. Overall, men outnumbered women amongst all those convicted of homicide, 80 to 20%. Whilst women in early modern England killed far fewer people than did men, their very nature was thought to make them more susceptible to committing the kinds of killings deemed premeditated acts of murder, rather than the less serious crime of manslaughter. There were important gender differences. Women were more likely to be responsible for the killing of children, for example. Most homicides were the result of blows from knives or blunt instruments. Some was strangulation and some poisoning. Gun-related crime was low. It accounted for 3% of deaths between 1560 and 1660, compared to 6.6% today. Male killers tended to use weapons, for example knives, swords and daggers. However, women tended to use either their bare hands, things like kicking, strangling and suffocation, and drowning, and they also tended to use poison. Domestic homicide was between husbands, wives or children, but also included servants in some cases. Husbands and fathers were imbued with natural authority over their wives, children and servants. The state believed that a well-ordered household led to a well-ordered state. The government of the household legitimised the use of correction and discipline. In Essex in 1560 to 1709, there were 431 homicides, of which 14% involved family members and 24% apprentices and servants. A husband guilty of murdering his wife could be hanged if found guilty. A wife guilty of murdering her husband was guilty not just of murder, but of petty treason, and her punishment could be greater. She would often be burnt at the stake. This very wordy slide is quoted from the Old Bailey proceedings of the 17th of January in 1681 regarding the domestic homicide of a servant. Elizabeth Wigginton of Ratcliffe Parish was tried for the murder of a girl about 13 years of age, which was her apprentice, the manner of the murder being thus. she being by trade a coat maker, and having set the girl upon a piece of work, she had not done it so well as she required, whereupon she beat her grievously, the which not sufficing her cruel rage, she went and got a bundle of rods, and a man to hold her, with which, after she had bound her, she whipped her so unmercifully that the blood ran down like rain. Yet she could not be persuaded to desist, until the girl fainted away with crying, and of her unmerciful usage in a short time died. Upon her trial she pleaded little in her own defence, only saying that she did not think to kill her, so that it being proved that she had been a cruel woman by all her neighbours, she was found guilty of wilful murder. One of the saddest forms of violent crime, which was a lot more common in those days, was infanticide. Illegitimacy was looked down on in the early modern period, and this, combined with the poverty associated with single parenthood and the lack of support from family, meant that infanticide was a sad but frequent part of life for the poorer classes in the early modern period, with people sometimes pretending a child was stillborn, or even hiding the pregnancy and keeping the birth secret. However, although the government did not support illegitimacy, it also came down very hard on cases of suspected infanticide, and the death penalty was the common punishment when detected. The lack of privacy from neighbours and the encouragement received by the community to watch each other for immoral behaviours in the early modern period meant that discovered infanticides were often those reported by neighbours. In 1624, a statute shifted the burden of proof on the accused by making concealment of the baby's body a crime. Considered to be one of the most heinous offences, infanticide law of 1624 made concealment of stillbirths a crime. Law worked against the interests of unmarried women. Until 1803, guilt was assumed. In the early 18th century, commentator Joseph Addison called those guilty of the crime monsters of inhumanity. Infanticide should not be entirely equated with murder. It was very difficult for single mothers, and abortion was difficult, dangerous, and illegal, and contraception almost non-existent. Some historians believe that infanticide was a crime forced upon women. There was a variety of types of punishment that was used in the early modern period. Punishment itself was an important tool in creating a deterrent for others, and the public display of it was particularly important. Executions were normally public, primarily hangings, but sometimes burning at the stake. People were punished for lesser crimes by being held in a pillory or stocks so that the public could see them. Ducking was common, and again this was done in public. Whipping was another thing that was carried out quite regularly. Punishments that were more private were things like fines, transportation, being put in prison, and sometimes even branding. I'm going to talk about some of these punishments in a little bit more detail. So first of all, fines. Fines were a common punishment of what they called petty crimes. Most often it was just a small sum of money, punishment for things like trespassing. Fines were also given for things like defamation, for scolding or drunkenness. Some of the higher courts, for example the Star Chamber, could impose higher fines. Often the value of the fine depended not just on the fine itself or the crime itself, but also on the income of the convicted person. There are a couple of examples of recorded fines from Hertfordshire. The first one from Hertford Borough Monthly Court of June 1625. It says, "At this court, Thomas Lee, shoemaker, being convicted of uproarious words spoken against Mr. Keeling, Mr. Bull, and Mr. Card, it is ordered that a distress be awarded against the said Thomas Lee forthwith for the sum of 3 shillings and 4 pence for breaking of the law." A second example in 1748 was an indictment against Thomas and Mary Fiffis, alias Vickis, and Elizabeth Thomas, all of Standon, for rioting and assaulting John King. They were fined 4 shillings each. As I mentioned earlier, the public penance of people was considered very important, and here's some examples of what happened in those cases. Ducking, for example, was used a lot before 1550 for things like trade crimes, for prostitutes and cheats, but by 1600 it was also used for scolding, which usually meant women. The picture on the right illustrates a scold's bridle, or sometimes called branks, which were also used as a device for punishing scolds and gossipers and slanderers in the 16th and 17th century, especially in Scotland, and again mainly used on women. The picture on the left is of pillories and stocks. Punishment was part physical and part psychological. It was used for petty crimes and for punishing sturdy beggars, but also to humiliate notorious criminals, extortionists, seditious individuals, fraudsters, perjurers, and sodomites. It was important to consider the location of stocks. They were usually placed in high traffic areas where punishment could be witnessed. There's a few examples from Hertfordshire of people who had these punishments. The Hertford Quarter Sessions of 1647, the constables of Hoddesdon and Amwell are to take Robert Blemley of Amwell to Hoddesdon for market day to set in the public stocks at 2 p.m. until 4 p.m. as he stands convicted of profane swearing 10 oaths and has not paid the fine of 10 shillings. The most common form of corporal punishment meted out by quarter sessions and assizes. In Surrey, 1700 to 1750, more than 2/3 of those convicted of petty larceny were punished by whipping. Whipping was also used for moral offences such as bastardy. In Hertford again, Helen Styles was found to be a very lewd and public strumpet, to be whipped in the public market at Hertford and kept to hard labour in the House of Correction for a month, and not to be delivered until she finds sureties. Another case was Moses Dunkley, who was convicted of larceny on his own confession, to be publicly whipped in the Angel Inn yard in Hertford, and then to be discharged. One slightly less common punishment was ear cropping and nose slitting. One example is the picture of a gentleman called William Preen, a London lawyer who was convicted of seditious libel in 1634. He was tried by the Star Chamber and punished by, first of all, having a £10,000 fine and degraded by the Oxford University and Lincoln's Inn. He stood in the pillory at Westminster and Cheapside and had one ear cut off and his nose slit, his forehead branded, and sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. Houses of correction were very different from the prisons we have today. They were mainly used for what they called the idle poor, for vagrants and runaway apprentices. The prisons were usually open, offenders could mingle and their friends bring them food and gifts. The idea of prison may seem better than hard labour, but prisons were awful places and the mortality rate was very high. There's an example from the Hertford Quarter Sessions of 1647. John Daniel, keeper of the common jail at Hertford, was being questioned for the escape of prisoners out of the same jail. He informed the court that the walls and other places were so old, weak and ruinous and decayed that it was impossible to keep prisoners safe in the said jail, and also that on the side of the same jail were certain low sheds or buildings erected, which gave prisoners breaking out of that jail great advantage to escape and go quite away. It's highly likely that the Abbey Gateway at St Albans is the oldest building to have been used for policing in Hertfordshire. Built largely under the Abbot Thomas de la Mare in 1366, the gateway, located roughly 100 metres from the west door of the abbey itself, contained dungeons into which ringleaders of the Peasants' Revolt had been thrown in 1381. In fact, the gateway contains two separate facilities, a local jail for the Liberty of St Albans and a house of corrections for both the Liberty and surrounding borough. The Liberty jail had a paved exercise yard for prisoners, and the house of corrections a piece of adjoining land for hard labour. The early modern period was famous for its use of the death penalty. However, the death penalty was used less than you might think. Often it was commuted. Its benefit was its deterrent value, and if it was used too often, this would be nullified. On paper, laws were harsher than the reality of actual executions carried out. There was considerable scope for less harsh penalties. For example, in 17th century East Sussex, 80% of people convicted of crimes punishable by death were saved from the gallows. Rough estimates indicate that only about half of those condemned to death were actually executed nationally. It was most frequently used for murder, but also for crimes that threatened the wealthy, like fraud, burglary, and highway robbery. Before the Witchcraft Act of 1736, it could also be used to execute alleged witches. Traditionally, any theft of goods totalling less than a shilling was classed as petty larceny and attracted punishments such as whipping. Any theft of goods that totalled more than a shilling was classed as grand larceny and was punishable by death. However, in practice, juries would often find the defendant guilty of a lesser crime than that which he was originally charged. This would be done either by a jury finding a defendant guilty of only one out of several charges, or by the jury deliberately undervaluing the goods that had been stolen. This resulted in the defendant being convicted of the lesser crime of petty larceny. Another wordy slide here, which is an illustration from Hertfordshire of someone convicted of the death penalty for theft. It's a report on Alexander Thompson on one collective petition. 10 people, including John Wealden, rector, the church wardens and overseers of the poor from Wheathampstead in Hertfordshire, on behalf of Thomas Smith, alias Cockle, a little farmer of Wheathampstead, convicted at the Hertfordshire Assizes for stealing 5 ewe sheep at a value of £4 and 3 lambs, value 20 shillings, property of Thomas Fellows the elder, a farmer at Hemel Hempstead. Evidence is supplied by Thomas Fellows the elder, Thomas Fellows Jr., the prosecutor's son Richard Gaddesden, Henry Randall, Thomas House, and the prisoner. It was claimed that the stolen property had turned up at Tuddington Fair in December 1786. Mention is made of Tuddington, Dunstable, and Kingsworth. Grounds for clemency: he has a wife and 5 young children. First offence, and was a hard worker. Initial sentence: death. Recommendation: no mercy. There are a lot of things to point out with regard to execution and what it meant in the early modern period. Dying a good death meant that the abuse of a body after death was the most severe form of punishment. For example, for treason, a person could be hung, drawn and quartered, which meant they were drawn by a horse to the place of execution, where they were then hanged and then disemboweled, beheaded, and then chopped into 4 pieces. A traitor could also be hung in chains, both left to die that way, but also displayed in chains after death. Convicts made speeches to the crowd before their execution, which was a major attraction for spectators. Execution wasn't always straightforward. Hanging was in fact, in the early days, just strangulation, and a drop system that would quickly break the neck was not introduced until 1783. Before that, people had to jump and could take a long time to die. After death, there were sometimes struggles for possessions of the corpse. It was a prime source of bodies to train anatomists, but relatives wanted a proper burial. An example from the Hertford Quarter Sessions of the 17th of April 1637 was an order that William Cole and Robert Grove, treasurers for the county, shall pay Mr. Webb, under sheriff, the sum of 44 shillings and 8 pence, disbursed by him about the hanging up in chains of Richard Troman at the last assizes, convicted of murder. There were a few ways of avoiding the death penalty once someone had been convicted. One of these ways was called the benefit of the clergy. This was an old benefit that someone who could prove that they were a clergyman, which later got watered down to just someone who could prove they could read the Bible in Latin, could be commuted from a death sentence if the crime was a first felony, but it also excluded the crimes of treason, rape, or murder. Another way was called the benefit of the belly or womb, and was a reprieve if a woman could prove she was pregnant. In order to prove this, she had to endure a humiliating semi-public inspection by several people. And finally, a royal pardon could be given in some circumstances. There are two very well-known executions that took place in the local area. The first one was Robert Snooks, who was the last man to be executed in England for highway robbery on the 11th of March 1802. Born in Berkshire, he was christened as James Snook on the 16th of August 1761. The fact that his name is commonly quoted as Robert Snooks is perhaps due to a corruption of his identity as the Robert Snook. On the evening of Sunday the 10th of May 1801, postboy John Stevens, travelling from Tring to Hemel, was threatened by a highwayman at Boxmoor who stole £80 from the post bags. James Snook was already a wanted man in connection with several highway robberies and had been indicted for horse stealing at the Old Bailey in 1799. For this charge he was acquitted due to lack of firm evidence. A reward of £200 was offered by the Postmaster General and a further £100 by Parliament for the capture of highwaymen, which occurred in December. He was transferred to Hertford Gaol on the 4th of March 1802 whilst awaiting trial. He was tried 5 days later and hanged 2 days after that, near the scene of the crime. Thousands witnessed the hanging, where Snooks is reputed to have exclaimed, "It's no good hurrying, they can't start the fun until I get there," whilst on his way to the gallows. Snooks' body was dug up the day after his hanging and interred in a coffin provided by the residents of Hemel Hempstead. A small headstone bearing the name Robert Snooks was erected by the Boxmoor Trust in 1904, whilst a footstone was installed in 1994 as part of the Trust's 400-year anniversary. The exact location of Snooks' hanging and subsequent burial is unknown, so the location of the stones is an approximation. The second well-known case took place in Tring and Hemel in 1751, after the 1736 Witchcraft Act, when witch hunting became illegal. Ruth Osborne and her husband John, both over 70, were accused of witchcraft by their neighbours, specifically because she cursed a Gubble-Cut farmer for refusing her some buttermilk which she was begging from him. His animals died not long after, and he developed epilepsy. The community wanted revenge. Notices were put up in Winslow and Hemel Hempstead that witches were to be tried by ducking at Longmile Stone Pool on the 22nd of April 1751. A mob gathered in Tring and found the couple, who had been hidden by the authorities. They were then stripped, their hands tied to their toes and thrown into the Longmile Stone Pool, and Ruth died from the ducking. Although witch hunting had been made illegal in 1736, the old traditions persisted and have been largely ignored by the authorities since the passing of the Act. However, the authorities wanted to make an example in Tring to deter future incidents, so one of the mob's ringleaders, Thomas Coley, was hanged at Double-Cut Cross in Tring for the murder of Ruth Osborne. At his execution, many of the crowd expressed their dismay at a man being executed for ridding the world of an evil witch. Transportation was a major innovation in penal practice, and the primary motivation was both its deterrent effect and the fact that criminals would be removed from society. Convicts were transported at their own expense or at the expense of the merchants or ship owners. It was an alternative to the death penalty, but no leniency was available. For example, the benefit of clergy wasn't. In the 1650s and 60s, transportation was used for political opponents or for defeated rebels and post-Restoration Quakers. In 1718, the first Transportation Act allowed courts to sentence felons guilty of offences to 7 years' transportation to America. In 1720, further statute authorised payments by the state to the merchants who contracted to take the convicts to America. In 1776, transportation to America was halted by the outbreak of the Civil War, and in 1787 transportation resumed, but instead to Australia. Although a welcome reprieve from the death penalty, transportation was normally a life sentence, despite the standard 7-year term handed down. Most would never return to see their family again, as they could not afford return fares. The journey and the life there was hard and perilous. Those who survived usually settled down to live in Australia, and some did make good. Former thieves became landowners and pillars of society. Transportation, however, started to decline in the 19th century, as it was expensive and housing convicts was unpopular in the societies they were sent to. An example for someone being convicted of transportation in Hertford is recorded in the Quarter Sessions of the 3rd of October 1664. It says, "Upon the request of Mr. Edward Manning, who is security with Captain Thomas May for the transportation of Samuel Traherne, alias Lewis, to the island of Jamaica, shall be speedily transported according to the contract lately made with the Sheriff of Hertford. Traherne ordered to be delivered from the gaol, where he is justly and duly convicted, to the said Mr. Manning." Where the law didn't offer punishment for some moral misbehaviours, popular justice stepped in. This often took the form of loud and noisy processions designed to humiliate members of the community. In England, they were mainly called skimmingtons, and these actually represented a link between the ruled and rulers, common folk and the elite. Tolerance, acceptance, or approval by those in authority resulted from a need to supplement official, yet by no means all-pervading and efficient mechanisms of the law by popular cooperation for the perceived overall good of the community. They were communal shaming rituals, usually for things like infidelity, adultery, or husband beating. Rough music was often a part of them, and it was often aimed at someone who had outraged propriety. They created noise outside the house of the accused. There was a cacophony of noise, derisive laughter, banging of pots and pans, and a discharge of weapons, sometimes letting off fireworks. And it was often preceded by a procession. There were parades of armed men sometimes, and a display of animal horns, which signified the cuckold. Often there were obscene pictures and mock proclamations or other pseudo-legal rituals. This was also called riding the stang. They had mock rhymes and songs and often lampooned politicians and people in the community. Riders of the stang were mostly proxies for the people that were being accused, like their near neighbours. They would often have to ride backwards, and sometimes participants were made to act out domestic conflict which had given rise to the demonstration in the first place. Law enforcement agencies, like constables, often took part or sometimes ignored the activity. They usually began and ended in an alehouse, and so were inevitably accompanied by a great deal of drunkenness. A contemporary author, Edwin Gray, in his book A Life in a Hertfordshire Village, 1860, left an account of how this was handled in Harpenden. According to Gray, members of the community would gather outside the offender's house at night, carrying kettles, tea trays, or any objects that would make a loud, discordant noise when banged. They'd make as much noise as possible for at least an hour on 3 successive nights. They'd also sometimes make an effigy of the offender, which would then be burnt on the village green, enabling the villagers to vent their anger without actually attacking the person. So justice did seem much more brutal in the early modern period to us today. Punishments significantly outweighed the crimes in a lot of cases, and the punishments themselves could be really very, very cruel and brutal. However, the times that they lived in, people felt in most circumstances that those punishments were justified, and it's hard for us to judge them from where we sit today.